Okay, welcome back, friends. I hope lunch was good. It was good for me. It was very tasty. All right, I hope after that lovely meal, this will not put you to sleep. So we go through our final session in putting it all together. Let's see. I'll move the slides forward. Okay, so we've talked about Vitali, what it is not, and you have looked at vision, mission, purpose statements, thought about those, and asking the question, what is God calling you to do and be at this moment in time? And now the question becomes, if you have statements, or as you've discerned what that call is, and put those into mission, vision, and purpose statements, the next question is, how do you live into the vision? How do you live into the mission? And how do you live into the purpose? And this comes into the category of what we like to call, I think, in the industry world, as strategic planning. How many of you have heard of strategic planning before? Okay, great. I hope that this is not strategic planning. This is actually church planning. It's living into the vision, the mission, and the purpose that you have set for yourselves. And so, what I'm going to do is share just a few ways that you can begin to do that planning. So, as I shared this morning, there's a difference between countables and measurables, but you still have inputs, which are the people and the resources, the dollars, the property, all of those things that are used as inputs to make disciples and change the world. But you use those things through activities, right? Through food banks, through worship, through other kinds of services that you do. That's the throughput. So you use those things, people, dollars, for activities. And then finally, the outcome, that which you don't count, but what you measure, is the difference or change to be accomplished, the impact. So I shared about this morning, but it's a helpful reminder as we go into what planning looks like, because you need to look at all three of these pieces when you do planning. So this is a helpful little exercise that I think is important, and it is based on your mission, vision, and purpose statements. And this is just basically articulating your outcomes. What kind of difference do you want to make based on what your mission statement says and based on your purpose and your vision? So the first column is basically just listing your outcomes. What's the difference you want to make? What's the outcome you want to have? The question here, based on our church's vision, mission, purpose statements, what is the difference you believe God is calling you to make? Just list them. And again, this happens through discernment, prayer, coming together. And on the right-hand column, you want to think about what spheres or what kinds of impacts that change will be. And I've listed 3 different spheres of influence or areas of influence for impact: individual, congregational impact, or community impact. And so different kinds of activities create different kinds of impacts. And so this helps you to name at what level are you wanting to make this particular impact based on your mission statement. So, for example, if you have a food pantry, that would be an impact for what? Church, community, or individual? It could actually be all 3. But I heard a lot of mumbling. What's a community, right? Community impact. Yes. So that's a broader community impact that you're wanting to make. So perhaps the outcome would be helping people in our community not be food insecure, right? Like, so that would be a community impact. What's another outcome you can think of? Maybe based on even a couple of the statements that you've shared or talked about this morning. What's something that you have done in your community that's had an impact? And what has been that impact? Okay. Yeah. 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 So making Christmas special for someone by giving gifts, right? And that is a community impact, right? Exactly. That's right. That's right. And this is where categories get kind of blurry sometimes because it can be an impact in all three areas, but you want to be as clear as possible just so that you're not feeling like you have to make an impact in all areas all the time. It helps to focus just so you're able to say, okay, well, this is clearly this piece, this is clearly this piece. And again, because we can't be everything to everyone, it just helps us focus a little bit what the impact and what the level of impact is going to be for a particular outcome that you want to have. And again, these are hypothetical outcomes. They should be based on the activities your church is doing now, right? And the activities that are grounded in mission, purpose, and vision statements. So this is just a basic sort of format, right? It's just asking the question, what are the outcomes or the impacts? And if I go back, it's kind of working backwards, right? So what's the outcome we want to have? But you need to know what the throughputs are and what the resources are. So looking at all of these three things in collaboration is really important in terms of your mission statement. So if you want an output or an outcome to say, and I'll give some examples in a minute. But for example, if you are in your community, you say, I want to eliminate hunger completely. What would you need? What kind of resources or inputs would you need for that? And what kind of activities would you need to do in order to make that happen as a church? And that helps you to be realistic, to say, these are the resources we have, and these are the activities that we can humanly do in a particular period of time. And so, given those two things, I don't think we can eliminate hunger completely in our county, right? So, you have to right size your outcomes or your hopes in your ministries based on the activities and the throughputs that you want. And this is where, again, it's really important to not get fixated on bigger is better. We're not making enough of an impact. We're not doing all these things. We're not, impacting all these people. It's really based and limited by the resources and the activities that you have. So if you have 10 people in your church, like they can do a lot, but they're just 10 people, right? So being clear about that and when you do any activity and any sort of limit that you have with an output needs to be taken into consideration. So there are several ways in which you can do planning, and these are, I'll say at the outset, pretty structured and boring a little bit, but they're very structured. And so I don't encourage these kinds of models for all churches if they don't want to do that, but it's still very helpful to think about, okay, people and dollars, what are our inputs? What are our throughputs, which are activities? And then what are the outputs we're hoping for? And so thinking about all of these things in conversation, this is what is called a logic model. And you see each of these pieces here. So the inputs is the square at the top. And I put under it resources such as people, time, talent, skill, physical space, systems, funding, etc. So that's inputs, right? The things you can count. Those are countables. That's what you have. But that flows, and you use those to the activities, right? You apply those to the activities that you do. Activities carried out using the required inputs. And that flows into your outputs. What are the immediate results? You host a Thanksgiving meal. Those people are fed. And then the outcomes and the impacts are then what are the short, intermediate, and long-term change or differences that you help to make in the world. You created an amazing meal where people could come together, have fellowship, and were fed on a holiday to give people a place and a sense of place in order to experience a good meal, right? And however you articulate that, right? That's the bigger why. The outcome is really the bigger change, right? The bigger why, and speaks to that. So logic models aren't often helpful. I mean, they're used a lot in business. But what I do want you to be mindful of here is that the little arrows that are in between each of these go both ways. So if you say, we want to do this in the community based on the needs that we are seeing in the community, and we want to eliminate hunger completely because that's a need, you have to look at your inputs, practices, and activities and your outputs in order to get to that place. So it helps you right size. It really does help you right size in that regard. I'll pause there because this is the more sort of complex kind of planning part. And I know that many of you aren't there, but this is something to keep in mind as you think about mission statements, vision statements, and as you actually then think about, well, how do my activities and the resources I have align with these bigger things? Questions? Thoughts? Confusing? No?
You also have to have those 10 people involved in all of this. Because it can't just be one person again. One person again. We have to have those 10 people also involved.
Yeah, and that's where planning really is a group thing, and again, it's group based on discernment, it's based on assessing needs, it's based on who the church is called to be in this time, in this place. So all of this sort of planning is the last phase, right? It rests on all these other pieces, knowing who you are, knowing what inputs you have, and knowing and discerning and aligning your activity with God's activity. Yeah. So let me give you an example of a church that went through this process. And this is very similar to the church that I have been working with over the last seven months. It's a UCC church, suburban, has a fair amount of money, has some resources. And so what I do here is I list their inputs. They have a church building and they have property. That's one of their resources. They have a couple of staff. They have a pastor, they have an associate pastor, and they have volunteers, right? Lay folks. They have time. There are several folks who are retired, so they've got some extra time. And they've got a couple of experts around food, around climate justice. They're a very climate justice church, as is the church I'm working with. And they've got a little bit of financial resources, not much, a few $1,000s extra to play around with. And they decided and they discerned that God was calling them to figure out a way to use their building and not right size their building, but help their building to be zero energy output and to be used only with renewable energy. So the electricity and that sort of thing would be on renewable energy, solar energy, basically, some wind energy. And they were trying to figure out how to do that in order to be faithful stewards of the resources that God had given them, and also to be true to their mission of protecting and caring for the earth. So these are the inputs that they had. So they discerned from that, and they looked at this is their outcome or impact. Care for the environment by significantly reducing the ecological footprint of our congregation's facilities and property. That was their outcome. This is something that they really wanted to do. So they looked at their inputs, and then they said, well, what do we need to do to get there, given the resources, given the inputs that we have? So, create and use, it's hard to read because they're little words. Create and use recycling bins for waste. Okay. Install solar panels on the church's roof. Okay. Create a compost area on the church's property for fertilizing the grounds. So those were 3 activities that they decided, we can do this based on the resources we have. Again, a logic model is basic logic. So this is sort of what it is. It's logical, right? Based on the resources you have, these are the things that they figured out that they could do. So they're like, okay, how do we do these 3 things? They had the time, and they had a little bit of money to do these things. So they created and used recycling bins for waste. They figured out how to do that. And they had volunteers who could buy the bins, put the bins, set them up, and make sure that they worked with someone to empty those bins on a regular basis. The installing the solar panels took a little bit more work, right? They had some people that had expertise, but really they needed to rely on outside expertise to do that. What they did have was some money to do that. And they also got a rebate from the energy company in order to install those solar panels as well. So the energy company helped them along with the money they had. So they sought out a company, got an estimate, and then they went about and did that, right? And then the third one, creating a compost. That required time, volunteers, and a little bit of expertise from someone who had done it before. Turns out there was another church across town that had done it. And so they relied on the folks who were running that compost to teach these church members how to do that. The church members had the time to do it, and there was enough willingness. There was a rotation of, I think, 5 people who were trained on how to do composting. And they set up a system in the church. Whenever there was a meal, whenever there was coffee and coffee grounds, they created a compost space and then worked with facilities to be able to use that to fertilize their grounds each year, right? And so with those 3 activities, they were able to decrease the amount of non-recyclable waste gathered by the church, decrease their reliance on non-renewable energy sources through the solar panel, and repurpose church property toward a sustainable use, right? The church grounds. They didn't have to rely on pesticides and things like that in terms of fertilizing. So they met their outcome and impact based on the inputs they had and the activities that they did. This is really basic because we all kind of do this in our minds already, right? This is what planning is. What resources do we have? How do we put them to use? And how do we do this? Interestingly, though, churches don't always start from this place, right? We start from sometimes outputs or outcomes that are much bigger than we hope for, or too many outcomes sometimes, and then we sort of get overwhelmed with like, well, there's all this need, I don't know how we can do this or if we're going to do this. And so creating these kinds of stepped processes just helps to right-size things, to say what's realistic, what's not, and it helps to get things down on paper so that you can plan. It also helps to write this out because, again, you want to make sure that you're aligning these activities with your mission statement, right? is what you're doing living into the mission, vision, and purpose? So this set of activities and the ministry impact that it had was in clear alignment, at least with the church that I showed you their purpose and vision statements previously, right? They care about the earth, they're aligned with climate justice. This is what they wanted to do. And this not only is a community impact because it decreases the amount of non-renewable energy that is being used by the community as a whole, it also impacts the congregation and anyone who goes inside that building and is on that grounds, right? So, questions about that? Thoughts? Too structured? Too simple? Has anybody ever done this kind of process before with any of the activities or the resources they have with the church? Yeah. 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 Has anyone ever used this kind of model before, this kind of process and planning? Or even thinking about the existing programs you have, the existing activities you have. Are they right-sized for the inputs and the resources that you have? That's a good question, right? That might be the more important question.
Just a comment, in our church, we're doing a number of things that may be too many for the size of our little church. But I think the part that's missing is that it's not necessarily a total church thing. It's you got this group helping with the pantry, and you got this group doing this other thing. And so it seems to me that's probably not the best way to do what we're trying to do here. It needs to be more collaborative across groups. Otherwise, you end up almost with informal cliques.
Right. And that's sort of the nature of church life, I think. I don't know if it's necessarily a bad thing because people have different interests. And so you're going to have folks who like different things. That's just sort of the way of church. But I wonder if it's a question or a matter of one part of the body doesn't know what the other part of the body is doing. And so how do you, as leaders of the church, bring all of these things into conversation with each other? And together say, wow, look at all the different things we're doing. How are we doing it with the resources we have? And that would be a great starting place.
Add to that, the church I went to previously, you always have a mission committee, right? Well, it becomes so much of an entity in itself that the rest of the church that are part of that sort of feel like, well, they're doing our mission work, let them do their thing.
Yeah.
Do other things. And so there's a sort of a disengagement from that missional attitude that's left only to those people on the mission. I quit the mission committee, so I wouldn't be on the mission committee, but still would be a congregation member participating. Because it just seemed to me it needs to be a little more broad-based to have buy-in.
Yes, yes. And that speaks to an issue of communication often, and as you said, buy-in. So what would it look like to do a whole church process based on all of the activities that are happening and say, what are the resources you're using for that and what are the outcomes? And then to have the whole church look at that and to say, what are all the impacts we're all doing? How can we own all of these pieces, even if we're not directly involved? How can we own all of this? It's hard because I'm someone who loves diversity, right? Like we have different gifts and we have different strengths as people, and so we're sort of plugged into doing what we are excited about. So the folks on mission committee are excited about mission and they're doing that kind of work. But as a whole, I'll get to you in a minute. But as a whole, I'll say, what does it look like for the whole church to say that's an impact that our church is having in the wider community in this way. And not just the mission committee, but everybody. And I think sometimes we just get so caught in the nature of ministry work as an industry. Right? We got the mission committee, we got the SPRC, we got the, right? Like our committees do our respective works. We're like a machine, but a church is not a machine. And so we want to be able to say, how do we come together and how do we do this together and have the whole church own it? And I think one of the ways is going through this kind of mission, vision statement process, and then looking at all the activities of the church and all the resources of the church and saying, how are they being utilized based on this? And then how do we maybe realign, or does there need to be realignment or not? Yeah, those are great comments. Yes, sir.
Right, in our community, there are a lot of nonprofits doing different things. And one thing we need to do there is put them in the loop too, to say, okay, this might be something we want to do. However, let's not duplicate something else that's already
Yes.
been going on by
Yes.
this nonprofit. How can we help this nonprofit?
That's right.
If that's something that's important to us. And we do have a lot, that's one way we get a lot of people involved out there, is this person is working with this nonprofit, and this is working with that one. But we get feedback from those individual connections to say, this is what they need, this is ways we can help.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is the church's impact. That can be measured, right? And I was talking with Pastor Burry. There are 4 members of the church on the board of a nonprofit that they helped to start, but they're not in control of it anymore. But there's still 4 members who are board members of it, right? Like if that's not a church's impact, I don't know what is, right? And it created its own a nonprofit that the church doesn't need to necessarily be in charge of anymore. That's really exciting, and it's important not to duplicate the work. And that's where you can look at these things and say, well, who are other people that are actually doing this, and what can we set aside and not do in order to focus on other things and what God is calling us to do?
And even taking it one step further, other churches, other small churches, what parts are they doing to work together on projects rather than all by yourself?
Yep, absolutely. And that is a gift of small churches, right? And partnership. I think it's easier for small churches to partner together. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but I think it's easier because there are fewer people, and to say, what can we do to pool our resources? How can we pool our inputs to make the kind of impact we want? Are there partners that can do this work with us? Yes, great point. Okay. So I gave you an example of this logic model. There are a few other ways. There are lots of other ways that you can do planning. I won't go through all of them, and I'll share this in a little bit. But there's some other ways to do it. There's a famous process, at least now in the last couple of decades, called Theory U. And it's really a process of change, how one engages change. But looking at what's existing, letting go of what exists, and giving space for something new, right? It's a less linear process or boxed process than the one I just shared with you in the logic model. But it's another way to maybe help councils, congregations, churches to move through a process of planning, also recognizing that there are lots of emotions that go on in that process. So the letting go gets down to the bottom of the U. That's why it's called Theory U. And then at the bottom of the U is the opening to something new, right? What is God calling us to do? And then up there, toward the upward slope of the U, as you go back up, is sort of the connecting, synthesizing, and then you create ideas to then get to say, well, how can we experiment and try something new based on the inputs and the resources we have? That's just one very broad overview of that process. I won't get into details about it. There's also what's known as a practical theological process, just sort of asking 4 basic questions. What is going on in the current situation? Why is this going on? what ought to be going on based on our mission and vision, and how might we respond? So this is a good set of questions for reviewing current activities based on your resources. So for example, what is going on? Saying, okay, we're doing these 10 things. This is what we're doing. The deeper question, why? Why is this? Why are we doing these things, right? What is the bigger why? What is the outcome? Given what we have, what ought to be going on in terms of how do we right-size this based on our resources and our activities? And then how might we respond is really what needs to be shifted in that process. You could also use this process in other ways about a needs assessment. Like if you're going into the community, you're asking the church, what needs do you have? And looking at it that way too. So there's lots of different ways. Again, this is sort of a more heady model, less concrete than the logic model, but it's another process that you might use to ask questions. Just sort of, why is this happening? Why is this going on? And does this align with who we are and who God is calling us to be? And there's one other process, and this goes along with a needs assessment, but lots of community organizers have their own specific process of doing community organizing. And this is from Industrial Areas Foundation and Michael Gacon's model, Effective Organizing for Congregational Renewal. And he relies on a basic community organizing process, which starts with individual meetings, asking people what needs they have, what are the issues they're facing at the base level. And this, again, goes along with a needs assessment. And then asks, well, where is power situated in these issues? And then there's teaching and training that happens. Well, how do we actually fix and organize to fix this, right? How do we assess those power models and how do we organize in order to change those issues? And then how do we then take action and then evaluate that action? These are just models of change, right? Processes of change that you would go through. I won't get into them again in too much detail because I really want us to focus on sort of this more basic model of inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes completely. Several years ago, I created a little booklet for the UCC that utilized this model to help churches do planning. And it included a little self-assessment survey of members who could take the survey, assess sort of what their strengths were as a church, what their challenges were. And then based on some of the results of that survey, could then begin to create a method or a model of planning that would help them live into the kind of vision that God wanted them to live into. And so I created this little spreadsheet, and it's a way just to map our congregation's outcomes or impact plan. So if you're doing planning for the year, you could say, okay, what are the things we want to do this year, right? And again, things always pop up, right? So being open to that, but just trying in the process of planning, what do we want to do this year? Like, what is our focus based on who we are, based on what our statements are? What are the resources we have? What are the activities? What are the immediate outputs? And then what's our overall outcome or impact that we want to make in the world? Very basic sheet, just using the 4 steps that of the logic model, but just a little sheet. I will say that none of these things that get written in boxes should not be erasable or editable. These things, again, are living documents, right? They're living plans. They shift, they change over time. Planning is not a one-time beginning to end process often. Circumstances change. Maybe people change. You had some people volunteering, they're not going to be volunteering, and that changes the scope or whether you're going to even do those things. But it's a helpful model to think about that and to know that what gets written on there is not going to be the end all be all, right? Just like your mission statement, your vision statement, and your purpose statement. It is not going to be the end all be all. These are just tools to sort of help shape and give life to the mission, vision, purpose. Any questions at this point? I know that's a lot. in a little amount of time. It's really the icing on the cake to the foundational work that you've been doing last night and today, this morning. Is this hard to envision at this point? Without doing the mission, like really doing that sort of mission vision statement reworking? This is what puts the flesh on those bones, right? This gets down to like, how are you living out those things?
And all that right there could go into that yellow worksheet that you just showed.
Yep.
You know, that are unerasable, you know. and-
They're erasable. No, they are erasable. Yes. They're they're not unerasable. They are editable always. Yes. Oh, good, good. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
I guess I just want to throw this in the mix. One of the problems that many churches have is, when you talk about a needs assessment, and figuring out talk about what your congregation or your community needs, sometimes we don't know how to do that well. Like sometimes if I'm in a group and we're trying to figure out what we need, we only know what we can see we need.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's this universe of needs that we can see, and then there's the universe of needs that we have but we don't see. So one of the things that the conference can help with is coming in and helping you using tools to identify needs that you don't currently perceive, but that are very, very real for your church or for your community itself. So I would just throw that out there. So if this feels like something, you may have done this over and over again, you feel like you sit down fairly regularly, you talk about what can we do as a church, right? But sometimes the phrase I always use that people may get tired of is you can only live in the world you can see. So if you think that your congregation needs to broaden what you can see, be in touch with me, be in touch with the Reddigs, and we can help broaden that perspective so that you may see some things that you don't currently identify.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. That's really helpful. And it's great that the conference and the district have those tools. Absolutely important. And that's the critical nature of a needs assessment when I shared the example of St. John's UCC, right? They were only able to really see the issues and the needs in their community when they had someone come in and talk to them about it. You're only able to really see the needs in a broader community when you go out and learn about it, right? What are the demographics in your community? What are the challenges? What are the issues? And that you have those tools is really exciting to be able to help churches do that. And again, I can't stress this enough. It's going beyond sitting down and saying, okay, what are the things that we can do as a church? That list is never ending. So being able to target and focus on what those needs are is absolutely critical with those tools. And then engaging in the process of discernment. Like who are we? Who are we now? And who are we called to be? In conversation with that is then how you then begin to address those needs and focus those needs based on what you think you want to address at that moment with the Spirit's guiding. Yeah, that's great, those tools.
Well, the light just went on my head. I don't know if you all see it. Yeah, when you said, you know, about what you could see, you know,
Yeah,
and when you meet in the church and you ask, you know, well, what do we need? All we're thinking is church. We're not
That's right.
thinking outside of the church.
that's right.
You know, so what we need, well, we need chairs, we need, you know, thinking about this stuff, you know. We need to venture out of our little bubble.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and ironically, these are boxes. You actually need to get out of the box in order to see this stuff. Even though I've created little boxes here, I once had a student tell me that she couldn't fill out her internship agreement because there were too many boxes and it constrained her. She felt constrained by boxes. Don't let the boxes constrain you. That's what I'm saying. Don't let the boxes constrain you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One of the tools I think that Jeff has displayed and discussed for us is tool for determining the demographics of your community, so that you have a much better understanding of what the demographics are that may lead to identifying maybe some needs or gaps or whatever. The other one was something that we used a little bit. We encouraged churches in the district to do it, and I think some did. And that was walking the community.
Yes.
And just doing nothing but just walking the community, spending time looking and talking to people on the street and whatnot, I think has a lot of value to starting to understand where people are coming from.
Yes.
And maybe you didn't think of it in your little group, in the church.
Yes. And that is the best expression of a needs assessment. That's it. That's as simple as it needs to be. Going and asking people things. That's right. Listening. Yep. Yep. And again, we don't, oh,
That's the same, when you, when, my kids used to be in a Shari group, which was the boys and girls. So in order for them to get their Eagle Scout badge, they have to go out in the community, these kids, and see what our community needs.
mhm.
Does this wall need to be painted? Does this empty building needs to be restored so it doesn't look empty?
Yep.
By painting the door, whatever, that's what we need to do.
Yep. Yep. Exactly.
We need to get out there and see what needs to be painted.
Yep. Exactly. And knowing that we don't have all the wisdom and all the knowledge. That's why we need the voices and the perspectives and the opinions of others. So if it's only the church council deciding these things, how does it really impact the whole, right? These things need to be a broader conversation, and you need to get input from different places, not only folks in the congregation, but also folks from beyond the walls of the church. And this is where you build partnerships, so you're not doing things alone. This is where other activities happen. Oftentimes, congregations, sometimes, I don't know if this is true in the appointment system, will rely on the pastor to be that community person. Well, you're out in the community, you're doing whatever you're doing. We don't need to do that stuff. You know, that kind of thing. And sometimes it's laity who are out there, and it's the pastor who's doing more internal things. And it's a balance, right? And so it takes everybody working together to what those needs are and how they align with purpose and vision. And again, keeping in mind that you're not called to do everything. Based on who you are, your special DNA as a church, what are you called to do? I think this is a really hopeful message for churches, especially small churches, especially rural churches, because it helps you live within what you have been given. What are the resources you have? What are the things you can do? And what are the things that you can do easily? Like, how can you reach beyond the walls of the church? What can you do, right? Like, it's based on not becoming something that you think you need to be, right? It's based on who you are in the moment now. Who you have discerned yourselves to be. I think churches spend so much time trying to be this ideal that they see out there. More people, more money, we have to have more of this, more of that, without ever realizing the gifts and the skills that they have within themselves that need to be utilized now. It's actually an underutilization of God's gifts to us now if we're not at work now, right? And always hoping for something else to happen. To be this other kind of church, that has this many people in it, this many dollars. When there are opportunities based on who we are right now. Okay. Small time. The questions for you now: in what ways do your vision, mission, purpose statements, or what ways could those statements lay the foundation for a planning process with outcomes? What planning process might work well in your context? What might not work well or need altering? could this work? Could this work with existing activities and resources? Or could it work with tools or resources might you need in order to do this kind of planning? So those are the questions before you. And I get that planning can be kind of a faraway thing, but this is where the rubber meets the road with those statements. So I think do your best. Imagine what planning or visioning can look like through discernment. And we'll come back, let's say 20 after. We'll give you 25 minutes. How's that? All right. You can coalesce where you are or meet someone new. Go.